Time for another game theory kind of video. I'm going to talk about I want to talk about this idea that some people put that video games are actually fighting games specifically. The level of skill in them is higher. That competitions are tournaments, I should say, are more competitive than ever. You know, the skill level across the board is higher. And I also want to talk about, as much as I talk about the games need to continue to be progressive, I want to talk about the dangers of progression, and I'm going to give multiple examples of games that potentially became too progressive and it made it worse or whatever the case. You know, I'm going to talk about a little bit about this. So rambling about those topics. But first of all, I see people talk about, and this is relevant because, say, you know, people are always posting about this Guilty Gear game that's coming out, right? And about how, like, you know, well, just in games in general, and I talk about it as well. Games in general, they keep making them easier. They're lowering the barrier of skill, which is funny because as well, you also have people that say like, oh, but tournaments nowadays are more competitive than they've ever been. You know what I mean? Like the skill level is higher. And I would say, well, if the skill level is higher, why do you even have developers? And why is there always this argument as well that games take less skill? Games are being made easier and easier throughout the years, right? Everyone wants to be the star quarterback, as I've said before in my analogy that I used. Everyone wants to be able to throw the Hail Mary pass or they don't like the game, you know, and blah, 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 whatever. You know, they want to post that one Twitter combo, right? And again, even developers talk about we're trying to make the game easier to play, blah, 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 blah. So my argument would be, how can you in your right mind say that tournaments nowadays, video games, the fighting game community, the skill level is better across the board when you can easily see, and even developers have admitted, they're trying to take away the skill in games. The skill level of the fighting game community has not gotten better. It's just that games have gotten easier, right? I mean, there's no reason to think like, oh, the competition is that much better because the players are better. The games are easier. I'll give you like a weird kind of like analogy of this, right? Some people in life are doing just enough to get by. Not every doctor that becomes a doctor is the best doctor. Some doctors just did enough to get by in college and they became a doctor. Right? I can use another. Maybe someone is just smart enough to get a job at McDonald's. They're not the best at McDonald's, but they were just smart enough to get a job at McDonald's. They did just enough to get by. And so if we're like using this in like a video game theory, a fighting game theory, they have dropped the quotation mark skill level in fighting games by such a large margin that it's easier for players to do just enough to get by to be competitive. Does that make sense? Kind of a weird analogy, but what I'm going to use, right? So again, I don't get this idea like, oh, tournaments are so much, you know, harder because the competition is more fierce, blah, blah, blah. Was the competition fierce because these dudes are actually better? Or is it because the game is inherently easier? And I'm not trying to say that video games take no skill nowadays. I'm not saying fighting games take no skill nowadays. I'm not saying that whatsoever. But there's definitely a difference in skill, a difference in what is considered an important skill. People don't like that execution is a part of being a skill. People don't like that mind games, guessing are a part of skill. People want, and again, and if we're even talking about for using that analogy, I use the school analogy. Some people, just because someone is a doctor doesn't mean they're a good doctor. Some people just did enough to get their doctorate degree. And that's a weird kind of analogy to think about it, right? Like, man, he's a doctor, he's got to be smart. He's like, well, he's the one doctor that did just enough to get by, right? You know what I mean? So maybe this person's like, oh man, he did just enough studying. And because I've said a lot of fighting games, they're trying to make them so predetermined and pre-planned. For how many years now have you been able to watch like a tournament in a fighting game where someone actually looks at their phone to try to like remember the frame data? They're reading the cliff notes of the match before the match starts, so they remember like, ah, yeah, this was the story. This is how the class, when I was studying for this class, this test, this is how it went. I did just enough to get by that I remember the frame data of this because this video game is so predetermined and pre-planned. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that studying doesn't take a skill. I'm a fucking idiot. Okay, I'm not saying that. I'm not very smart. Right? I'm not saying that video games take no skills nowadays, but video games, fighting games, are very predetermined, pre-planned now, right? You could say like, oh, the competition is more fierce because yeah, because your job, what it takes to be competitive, is different, right? Again, not saying it doesn't take any skill. I'm not trying to like hate on anyone per se. It's just like a thought, right? And obviously, legacy players, if we call them that, are still good because they have an inherent amount of skill still. You know what I mean? Because I'm not saying that fighting games don't take any skill besides this whole, predetermined. Everyone wants the video game to be a math problem. Even look at this, Dragon Ball FighterZ Brawl was coming out. You know what I saw people just posting? They're just like, oh, we saw his jab, his 10 frames, whatever. Like, do you realize how weird that is? It just goes to show you that people are so concerned about the math problem of a video game now. It's like we have to read this math problem, like because the games are so predetermined, right? It's fucking sad and it's weird, right? And you could also say the fact that you actually see perhaps nowadays more than ever quotation marks younger players, maybe quotation marks maybe newer players that kind of burst on the scene and become pretty legitimate threats, right? That maybe weren't as much of a legit role, I guess, if they didn't exist before. And that argument is a little bit iffy because, again, I don't know everyone's history. I know technically, if you look at me, look at my history. I didn't know I could enter video game tournaments, and I said my very first video game tournament, I beat everyone there besides the guy who was considered the second best at the Midwest at the time, right, in Street Fighter. People were placing at ECC and all this kind of shit before this tournament, and I went and I demolished everyone besides the guy that got second, that was considered the second best in the Midwest, right? And then right after that, I beat, I don't want to say all their names, famous people in tournaments, right? Really famous people, dude, like demolish them, right? You know what I mean? So I was winning really quickly off that. But was that because I was new? I mean, technically I was new, but I had played Street Fighter before as a kid, right? You know what I mean? I just didn't know I could enter tournaments, right? So I don't want to say that too much, like talking shit about newer, younger players per se, because there could be a lot of younger players that actually maybe they do have experience in other fighting games. They have played before. But there's also certainly that argument on that same token that nowadays you do see that idea of players that come out of nowhere and like, wow, this guy's doing pretty good. Doing better than he would, like, again, if it's considered like a guy come out of nowhere and do good in like a quotation marks real game, maybe. Quotation marks, right? An old school game per se, we might say, right? Anyway, so that's that topic. I just want to get that out of the way. I just think it's like, oh, tournaments are the competition is so much better now. Players are so much more smart. And it's like, well, what the fucking math problem you have to solve now is so much more easier. It takes less skill to be skillful. You just have to, if you study for the test, you've done just enough to get by. I know that's a weird analogy, but think about it, right? You didn't study, you didn't like read the cliff notes of a match before you played a game before, you know what I mean? People still play Super Turbo. When you watch a Super Turbo tournament, people aren't like, oh, that move's +5, this move's +1, blah, 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 fuck my titties, right? Because it's not how you played the game, right? Anyway, besides that though, another topic I wanted to talk about was the topic of how games can be too progressive, and there is that kind of fine line of being danger, right? And not just games being too progressive, characters can be too progressive where it can hurt the game, right? Try to think of how I should segue into this, right? So again, I definitely think games should be progressive, right? But there does come a point when, I'm not saying that like, because I'm not saying that when we're on this topic, actually, because it sounds like I'm hating on it per se, that frame data is more important in fighting games. And that's not exactly what I'm saying, because I'm not against the idea of quotation marks fishing for counter hits. You didn't do that kind of shit in old school Street Fighter 2, right? You know what I mean? Or frame trapping, whatever, you do tap, tap, tap in a little bit of a different way in video games now, right? Sometimes a big different way, right? But I'm not saying that the idea of counter hit setups and, frame data being a little more important in fighting games isn't necessarily a bad idea, right? Because games do have to progress. You have to throw a new spin on a video game all the time to keep people buying, to keep it something new. But there does become that danger, and especially with characters, that you can only become so progressive before it becomes potentially detrimental to the game. A game system idea that I've said before that is a bad progressive thing for fighting games was EX moves. EX moves, when you think about them for a little bit, they're like, okay, EX moves are cool, but EX moves, for a lot of the time, they became just, wow, this is just a souped up regular move, maybe obviously EX move, right? It does 2 hits and it's my juggle move. This is my juggle. It does like one more hit and it's my juggle move. There's a little more damage. And it became really, that's progressive in a bad way because that's not actually evolving the game, right? Like King of Fighters had a big problem with this when King of Fighters did it, you know what I mean, as well. You know what I mean? I know someone was saying like, oh, but King of Fighters had EX kill. His running blow you up move was actually a throw. And it's like, well, that's a example of an EX move that was actually different, right? You know what I mean? So there are those obscurities where the EX move is actually different and throws a new spin. But too many times EX moves actually are just like, oh, my character, I guess if we have meter, this is my EX move and I can do this for a little more than blah, blah, blah. And then you have to give every character EX fireball. So it's like, this isn't really changing. And I talked about this in the my EX video. Watch that if you want, if you're smart enough to know what the fuck I'm talking about. But EX moves, like, it's kind of like, wow, you just kind of took that step forward, but you ended up in the same place because you just went in a circle. When you give everyone that same kind of EX move, like everyone's EX move can do this, everyone's EX move is going to juggle, but it's like, so it's like you just kind of went in a circle. It's like, yeah, I guess you progress the game, but if everyone kind of has the same thing that their EX moves do, it doesn't go anywhere. It's not actually, it's like fake progression, right? And that's why I said EX moves in a game like Guilty Gear were actually done much better because the X move is actually a different move. Generally speaking, it's doing something different, right? And going back to the Street Fighter, too many times the EX move, and I wanted to talk about the characters here because we're talking about the dangers of progression in a video game and the dangers of progression in a character. Too many times the EX moves were given to a character to compensate for them losing something, right? So again, this is kind of long-winded, but again, Ryu, once you got the Street Fighter 3, he had always had the red fireball. Well, since Super Street Fighter 2, he had the red fireball, right? Unless you want to count the glitch red fireball, but you get what I'm saying, right? Red fireball knocks down. Well, they took away Ryu's red fireball, right, in Street Fighter 3. Then in Second Impact, when they added EX, it was like, well, let's add the EX fire. Let's give him the red fireball so the fans still feel like he's doing a red fireball, right? But it's his EX move, so now he has the fireball that knocks down, right? So in that sense, it's kind of like, oh, well, you're giving him something that he kind of had before, but you're giving him an excuse to make it an EX move. This is why I talk about this circle, just kind of like, what do you call it, like an Ouroboros? It's like, I don't know, it's kind of like, well, did that really progress the game? You know what I mean? It's kind of like, well, you just kind of like made it an excuse to take away one move to then add it to an EX move. You know what I mean? And like I said, I think the King of Fighter game really did EX move bad as well. But besides a few examples, anyway, but character progressions are dangerous too because look at a game again. We'll use Ryu, right? A game like Ryu, you think of him as a Fireball, Dragon Punch character. You know what I mean? But you want to progress Ryu, so you started giving him like overheads, which some people think that, and how most of the time this has even been out. I think it's generally been gone. And again, I could get really specific, so maybe I shouldn't get that specific. Anyway, but some people don't even like the idea that Ryu has an overhead. They think his character type shouldn't have an overhead, right? Combos, as games have progressed more and more, we can see that Ryu's fireballs have gotten, they're not as good. Probably because people complain about Fireball, Dragon Punch traps, complain about DPs. But also as combos have progressed in video games, since every character, not that characters didn't have combos before, obviously, but since every character there is a clear mindset that this character has bread and butter combos, you could say, we want to make these attributes of Ryu, his core attributes, worse, maybe potentially if we're thinking about that way, right? Because we're giving him combos. We want to give Ryu a new special move, so we'll give Ryu this thrust kick. Well, we already he has a red fireball that knocks down, so we don't want to have like a red fireball that knocks down and like a thrust kick, you know what I mean? So I'm not sure if you're going to try and, I'm trying to think of how kind of eloquently put what I'm trying to talk about. Characters can only progress so much, the idea of a character, until you got to start taking away moves from the character, because it doesn't make sense for the character to have so many options, right? Because characters should have weaknesses. Characters should have strengths and weaknesses. Not every character should have good bread and butter combos. Not character should have good overheads, good mix-ups. Every character should have strengths and like attributes that are worse than others, you know what I mean, and vice versa. So there becomes that problem of that when you're trying to like progress these games and the characters, too many times in the game while they're trying to progress the character, they end up just giving the character something new while taking something away. And it just is, it's kind of like sad, right? I'm trying to, God, these are just kind of like off the cuff, right? Hopefully you get what I'm trying to say. It's hard to actually make characters totally progressive while never taking something away from them, right? So King of Fighters was an interesting game, and I think every game should actually do this, right? King of Fighters was interesting because King of Fighters actually did EX characters really interesting. Like, I don't know who was the character designer for all the King of Fighter characters, but there's a lot of King of Fighter characters where you're like, wow, this character was redesigned and they were actually even cooler. Like Kyo with Fire Punches, Ryo with, he became, he lost his Fireball, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And these EX characters, they were still progressive takes on the character while still allowing the player to appreciate and enjoy the old version of the character, right? Because too many times now, even in new video games, say you want to add a new character, right? And it's like, how many times can you add a new character and make the new character unique? Too many times you see a new character, and the new character is just basically a mishmash of some of the old stuff you loved about old characters. It's like, oh, this character has this move that I like from this character. This character has this move that I like from this character. Because you know what? They couldn't keep progressing this character like in a fun way, whatever. And that's something the King of Fighters actually used to do really good. And I think that's something they should have done in Street Fighter because a lot of characters are just kind of like, this is just this character, but they didn't want to, whatever. Boy, I should have thought of a more eloquent way to explain what I'm talking about. Anyway, another example of like where progression was bad for a game. It was going good, right? Soul Calibur 2, right? Coming off again, this is relevant because Soul Calibur 6, whatever, it came out last year in this new version, right? Soul Calibur 1, when it first came out, Dreamcast, right? Very popular, had a ton of steamers. Soul Calibur 2, very popular. Characters would give me a buttload of moves. But look at a game like Soul Calibur. Ever since Soul Calibur 2, it's like they felt that they weren't confident in the progression of the characters and the game almost. Like the characters they're like, well, we're worried that we're progressing the characters too much. But in a 3D game, you have because there's so many, man, there's just so many options you can do in 3D. Like Soul Calibur is a game that just totally fucked themselves because they just didn't trust the progression. They just started making characters taking away this move, taking away this move, taking away this move. They went way too far in Soul Calibur. And I think that's one of the reasons that Soul Calibur is such a, to be honest, I saw that Soul Calibur 6, they said because of the fan, they were so impressed that the fans like Soul Calibur 6 that they had the season 2. And I was like, dude, I didn't know anyone liked Soul Calibur 6. I thought this game fucking failed. I feel like almost everyone hated this game. Not hated, but it was just like such a, whatever, how Soul Calibur survived, right? But the thing is, the soul is still burning for Soul Calibur 6, like it's like it's a dim light for Soul Calibur, right? Because they just didn't trust the progression of the characters, right? You know what I mean? They just started taking away too much. So like Soul Calibur I should have wrote down exactly what I wanted to say for this video. Anyway, this is going too long. Hopefully at least some of that what I talked about made sense. I should have wrote this down, what I wanted to talk about, but this video is already fucking long enough. Yeah.